Imagine living in a world where breaking the law didn't just mean a fine or jail time. It meant being skinned alive, boiled in oil, or slowly cut into pieces while the crowd cheered. This was the reality in ancient China, a civilization that perfected both philosophy and cruelty. Today, we're uncovering 10 punishments so shocking, so unbelievable, you'll wonder how anyone survived under such laws. And yes, these weren't myths, they were real, recorded in history. Let's dive in. Law and order in ancient China. To understand these punishments, we need to step inside the world of ancient Chinese justice. This wasn't a society where laws were just written down and politely followed. The legal system was built to control millions of people through fear. Influenced by Confucian ideals, order and hierarchy mattered more than individual rights. Disobey your parents, insult an emperor, betray the state. Any of these could get you a punishment so severe it would make medieval Europe look merciful. The law wasn't about fairness. It was about absolute control. Lingchi, death by 1,000 cuts. Now, let's talk about the punishment that terrified even the bravest warriors. Lingchi, better known as death by 1,000 cuts. Imagine being tied to a wooden frame, fully conscious, as an executioner makes cut after cut, tiny slices designed not to kill you quickly, but to keep you alive through hours of agony. This wasn't just an execution. It was theater. Crowds gathered, not to see justice, but to witness a human body slowly taken apart. According to the historian Sima Qian, Lingchi was the ultimate warning. Betray the emperor, and your death wouldn't just end you. It would destroy your memory, your honor, your very humanity. It was less about punishment and more about making you a message. Flaying alive. As brutal as Lingchi was, some punishments took cruelty a step further. One of the most feared was flaying alive, the slow peeling of skin from the body. Picture this: the process often began at the face, working downward, with the victim forced to stay conscious as their very skin was stripped away. Historian Ban Gu recorded this punishment in the Book of Han, noting it wasn't just about death, it was about turning the victim into a living warning. The skill of the executioner mattered, because the goal was to keep the condemned alive as long as possible. Every scream, every moment of agony, was a public performance meant to show the unstoppable power of the state. In ancient China, punishment wasn't only physical, it was psychological warfare, carved into human flesh. Execution by elephant. If flaying was horror in silence, then execution by elephant was horror in spectacle. Imagine a massive elephant trained for years, not for battle, but for execution, towering over the condemned. With a single step, bones shattered. Sometimes it wasn't quick. The elephant was trained to drag the victim, crush limbs one by one, even prolong the torment under the command of its handler. In China, as well as other parts of Asia, this method wasn't just about killing, it was a performance of raw power. The Tang Dynasty poet Du Fu referenced it in his writings, a reminder that the ruler's authority was as unstoppable as the weight of the beast itself. In front of crowds, the message was unmistakable. Defy the empire, and you'll be crushed literally under its power. The Kang. Not every punishment in ancient China involved blood or death. Some were designed to break the spirit instead. One of the most common was the Kang, a massive wooden collar locked around the prisoner's neck. It could weigh up to 50 pounds, making even the smallest movement an exhausting ordeal. Eating, drinking, even lying down became nearly impossible. But the worst part, the Kang, was public. The condemned were forced to stand in busy marketplaces, exposed to ridicule, spit, and scorn. Historian Zhong Tingyu wrote of the Qing dynasty's reliance on this device, not just to punish, but to humiliate, turning shame itself into a weapon. In a society built on honor and hierarchy, public disgrace could feel worse than death. Foot binding, torture. Not every form of torment came from the courtroom. Some came from tradition itself. Foot binding, what some called the creation of the lotus foot, began when girls were only 4 or 5 years old. Their toes were deliberately broken and forced under the sole, their arches snapped, and their feet tightly bound to halt growth. The result was considered beautiful, a sign of status and marriageability, but the cost was lifelong agony. Women lived with constant pain, infections, and permanent disability. Historian Song Yingxing recorded how the process turned each step into suffering, a quiet torture disguised as elegance. Unlike a public execution, this wasn't over in an hour or a day. It was a life sentence, carried out in silence, generation after generation. Boiling alive. If public humiliation broke the spirit, some punishments aimed to sear terror directly into the crowd. One of the most infamous was boiling alive. The condemned were lowered into massive cauldrons filled with water, wine, or even oil, which were then heated until the liquid roared with bubbles. The screams of the victim weren't just background noise, they were part of the sentence. This was a punishment meant to be seen, smelled, and remembered. The feared Song dynasty Judge Bo Zhang, known for his unshakable sense of justice, is said to have ordered such executions to remind all of society that no crime would go unanswered. Imagine standing in that crowd, the steam rising, the cries echoing, knowing this was justice in its rawest and most horrifying form. Death by sawing. If boiling alive was terrifying enough, some punishments took cruelty to another level. Death by sawing involved suspending the condemned upside down and slowly cutting them in half, usually starting from the groin. This wasn't just execution, it was a prolonged spectacle of agony. The victim remained conscious for as long as possible, blood rushing to the head, every second amplifying the horror. Ancient historian Sima Guang recorded this method as a deterrent for those who posed significant threats to societal order. The goal wasn't just to punish, it was to instill fear across communities, ensuring that everyone who heard of it would think twice before breaking the law. Chinese water torture. Not all punishments relied on blood and fire. Chinese water torture was a method of psychological torment that seemed deceptively simple, but was incredibly effective. The condemned would endure the slow, repetitive dripping of water onto their forehead, sometimes for hours or even days. At first, it seemed harmless, but the unpredictability of each drop drove victims to the edge of madness. This wasn't about physical pain, it was about breaking the mind. The relentless monotony and uncertainty forced the individual into a state of extreme mental distress, showing that sometimes the mind could be more vulnerable than the body. Being buried alive. Among the most terrifying punishments in ancient China was being buried alive, reserved for the gravest offenses, such as betraying the emperor. The condemned would be buried up to their necks, left to face death by exposure or asphyxiation. This method wasn't just physical, it was deeply symbolic, erasing the individual's existence in both body and memory. Records from the Qin dynasty, particularly those chronicled by the historian Sima Qian, highlight how this punishment reinforced the absolute authority of the emperor, instilling fear across the population. It was a stark reminder that defiance could lead to the most unimaginable consequences. Flogging. Flogging was one of the most common punishments in ancient China, applied for offenses ranging from minor infractions to serious crimes. The condemned would be whipped with bamboo canes or sticks, often in public, to serve as a stark warning to others. The number of lashes varied, with the most severe crimes resulting in hundreds of blows, sometimes fatal. Historian Sima Qian documented cases where flogging led to severe injuries or even death, underscoring its brutal effectiveness. Beyond physical pain, flogging also shamed the individual publicly, reinforcing societal norms and the authority of the ruling class. Reflecting on these harrowing practices, it becomes clear that ancient Chinese justice was as much about deterrence and control as it was about punishment. From slow slicing and flaying to boiling, water torture, and public flogging, each method was designed to instill fear and reinforce the authority of the state. These extreme measures reveal a society where law, power, and societal order were inseparable, and where the consequences of disobedience were shockingly severe.